Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the seminar on the law faculty hiring process, insights from hiring chairs and new hires. My name is Richard Albert. I'm the William Stamps Farish Professor in Law and Professor of Government here at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm also director of the host for today's program, the International Forum on the Future of Constitutionalism, whose mission is to marshal knowledge and experience to build a world of opportunity, of liberty and dignity for all. On this day, Juneteenth, I ask us all to stand in solidarity with those who are mobilizing for justice and peace and reconciliation, not only here in this country, but around the world. The death of George Floyd has unleashed a momentum that feels, to me, unlike anything I can remember. So let's all do what we can to keep that momentum going. For today's session, part of my objective in organizing it was to demystify the appointments process in law, and to make available resources and advice to those who don't attend the handful of schools that dominate the hiring market, and also to those who remain woefully and quite sadly underrepresented on law faculties here in this country. And to help us do that, I'm really happy to have four guest speakers. Vikram, Amar, Dean of the College of Law at the University of Illinois. Elizabeth Katz, Associate Professor of Law at Washington University in St. Louis. Anthony Kreis, currently a visiting assistant professor of law at Chicago-Kent and an incoming first-year professor at Georgia State University in just a few weeks. And Melissa Wasserman, my colleague here at Texas. She's a Charles Tilford McCormick Professor of Law here at the University of Texas at Austin, and also the chair of our hiring committee. I am not exaggerating when I say that this was my first round of invitees. I sent an email to all four. I said, would you please do this? They all said yes. And I'm really happy that this is the group that you have, because it's the group that I wanted to give you. We'll begin with remarks from each of the speakers, and the rest of the time will be reserved for questions from you, the registrants, and we'll end at about 3:30 Eastern time. When the time comes, if you'd like to ask a question, please just send me a message in the private chat function on Zoom. Tell me your name as you'd like to be introduced, and just a short word or two about the question so that I can endeavor to group the questions by theme. And without any further ado, I think the speakers are unmuted, and we'll get started. What I'd like to do is to maybe begin our conversation by raising some questions for each of the speakers. And so let's begin with Anthony. Anthony, congratulations on your appointment. From the perspective of an entry-level applicant, what are the actual mechanics of applying for a job, tenure track position at a U.S. law faculty?
Yeah, so this is I think the way I'll answer that is kind of frame it in if I was looking at going on the market this year, what would I be doing in June and in July, looking forward to the market, which really picks up in August and in September, October. So I think candidates at this period would really want to start to think, very first thing they would want to do is think about who they are as a scholar, right? So what drives you, what motivates you, what are you working on, what do you want to work on in the future? Because that answer, whatever it is, will animate everything that a candidate needs to do going forward. So, right, of course, the very first thing that people think about is the FAR form, which is the Faculty Appointments Register, which is on recruitment, which is through AALS, and I'll talk about that in a second. But before you even get to that, right, there's different components that people need to start working on well in advance. So the first thing, or the first few things, is you have a CV, obviously, that details your publications and your accomplishments in law school and the work experience and things like that. You have a research agenda, which will detail some of the things that you've worked on perhaps in the past, things that you are working on now, scholarship you want to work on in the future. And of course, you'll have, a variety of different additional things that you want to include in your packets, and I'll talk about it in a second. But I think that generally you need to have some kind of message, right? You have to know what you're about and where you're going and what you want people to know and how they want, how you want to be perceived by them as a future colleague. So those are kind of the broad 40,000 foot level things that I think people should be thinking about from the very beginning, right? Who are you? What are you all about? But beyond that, right? Well, there's always the big hump is the FAR form. I'm not sure when it's due this year, but it's always usually early August. Last year was July 31st, so it was a little sooner than usual. And the FAR form, essentially is just a form that takes your basic information, educational background, publications, work experience, things like that. And this form is really crucial because it really serves for a lot of faculty as it's kind of it's the first pass that they can do in looking at who might be a good fit. And so one of the big keys is making sure that and the part of the form that asks for what kinds of classes you want to teach, that it's very clear what you want to teach, that the package that you're presenting to faculties is coherent and makes sense. But it also, want to make sure that that there's core courses in there, right? So not every course, should be law and society kind of courses, or, law and literature, or law and something, because faculties are hiring for, right, Core 101 courses, big, required classes, classes that are generally thought of as like things that people should really take. That's important how you market yourself there. But on the FAR form, you also get to upload your research agenda, your job talk paper, which is important as well. And this year, I believe there's actually a separate form for references. So before you used to cram all your references onto the FAR form, and it was terrible because you really had to pick and choose and manipulate, and it was not fun. But now you actually get to upload your own references, so you don't have to just pick 3. You can actually pick the number that you feel appropriate. But these are all crucial things. So in filling out that FAR form, right, I think that it's important that you have a good research agenda ready to go to upload whenever it's time, and that research agenda has been thought out and thought through about really showing off the fine work that you have done and that you want to do, and similarly. That you have a job talk paper ready. Because before, it used to be the case that you had a little bit more time, it seemed, to send your draft job talk paper, which is essentially, right, a law review article that's either just recently accepted for publication or that you're about to submit in the near future for publication. That would be the basis of the talk that you give if you're lucky enough to get called back to a law school for a second round interview. So before, law schools would often ask you for that job talk paper in advance of an interview request or immediately after an interview request. It really depended on law school. But now that you have an opportunity to submit it with your FAR form, right, it's really important to have that, I think, done. But all these things, right, it's the big key is having the time now in June and July to work on all of these things and to really get a lot of feedback and to put a lot of effort into, right, drafting, editing, and perfecting all of these different things. But after the FAR form, and I'm sure there's plenty of time for Q&A after, we could talk about more granular details, but after the FAR form, there is an opportunity to submit individual packets to appointments committees. So the AALS will send out a bulletin, which will have a lot of different schools' advertisements in it. Prof's blog and Faculty Lounge will also post different law schools that are looking for faculty. And many of them will say that it's okay, if not encouraged, to send a packet. And the nice thing about a packet, as opposed to just the FAR form, is that you can use a packet and send it through email to signal interest in a particular law school. So it gives you the opportunity to submit a cover letter where you could talk about why you might have a particular interest in a certain school. It gives you the opportunity to submit actual versions of other publications if you want, or I think I sent 2 additional publications and my teaching evaluation since I had some. So it really allows you to provide a greater amount of information with more depth to law schools, in addition to signaling a particularized interest. So after all that, whether it's the FAR form and maybe a combination of sending particular or specific packets to law schools if they want them, is the first round interview. Now, the rest of this is really contingent on what happens with the pandemic, because nothing's going to look like it did last year and in years past. But the basic gist of things is there's a screening interview, which we used to call the meat market, but most schools will probably do Zoom or Skype and things like that. And this is just an opportunity for you to meet with the appointments committee. So it might be anywhere between 2, or I think I had once up to like 8 faculty members interview you for the first round. And they're very generic questions sometimes, or sometimes they're very specific about your paper. Sometimes they're really detailed about what kind of classes you want to teach and why. It really runs the gamut, the kinds of questions you get depending on the law school. So you really have to be prepared for any kind of question, both general or very specific about your research and teaching interests, your teaching style, why you want to be a professor. It really could be a whole number of things. Frankly, I got every kind of question in the book in my first interview. So you really have to be prepared. But the biggest thing is, and this goes back to my initial thought, is that oftentimes you have to give an elevator pitch at the beginning about who you are, what your agenda is, and or what your research or what your job talk paper is about. And it really could be tempting to give a 5-minute conversation or have a 5-minute response to what your job talk paper is and what you are about as a scholar. But these first round interviews are basically 20 minutes. So that's not particularly a good use of your time. And people can kind of lose interest if you go on too long. And it's also, I think, a better use of your time to be conversational if you can. So it's important to have in those first round interviews, a good 1 minute, minute and a half response about what your job talk paper is about, what your research agenda is about, and how they may interact with one another. So it's really important to do that. It's important to research the schools and know about their curriculum, maybe know something about where they're at, what they're doing institutionally. The more information that you have on background, signals interest. So, that goes for any job interview, but that's kind of how that works. If you get, if you make a good impression on the interview committee or the hiring committee, you'll get invited back for a callback, Again, different because it's virtual. Traditionally, it involves a dinner, a day of interviews, and then a job talk. At Kent, when we've interviewed some folks in the last few months virtually, it hasn't been terribly different in the sense that you will still have all day interviews. And so we had group interviews on Zoom, and then someone had an opportunity, or the candidate had an opportunity to give a job talk. So the structure is more or less the same. You probably miss out on dinner, but it's a long day. So I guess keep that in mind. But the key there is the job talk and having the opportunity to present your paper, usually in about 20 minutes or so. It's oftentimes, I think on average, they were slotted for a full hour. But the real key is, can you present your paper in an easily digestible, fairly easily distillable manner and communicate your main thesis and some of the details and overarching kind of idea of what your paper is about. But I think the real key is faculty want to see how you react to questions. So being able to have a conversation with potential colleagues and really engage in your ideas and be tested on them and be prodded on certain points that faculty might want to make or might want to point out is, I think, really important, So being able to do that, in a way that's thoughtful and intellectually engaging and collegial are all important signs, I think. But that requires practice. So just like all those other elements, the CV, the research agenda, and the job talk paper itself, June and July require a lot of time editing and working out and sending out for comments. Job talk papers or job talk presentations also take time and practice. So, to the extent that you can ask someone to practice with, if you have a VAT position, or if maybe faculty at your home law school where you graduated from would be willing to help, but any kind of help that you can get in presenting that 20-minute talk and then maybe getting some Q&A after would be very helpful. And then hopefully you get an offer after that. I think the big takeaway that I would give, in terms of advice, and I'm happy to chat about this more in the Q&A. It's, really so much of this it's time consuming, and it's very stressful. It takes a long time. So I think that's the very first thing I would say, right? It takes a long time for faculty to get back to you. It takes a long time to hear from faculty sometimes, right? Just because you don't hear things, silence doesn't mean rejection always, because, committees don't always meet at the same time or regularly, and there's scheduling problems. They're going to call back numerous candidates, so it's a very long process. So I think you have to go into it knowing it's a very long process. Otherwise, you'll drive yourself crazy, kind of wondering what's going on when nothing's happening at all, and that's normal. That's par for the course. But the same thing. It's a long, because it is a long process, and it is a long haul. Being able to do as much as you can at the front end in the summer months in particular, before things really get heated up, I think is important. So to make sure that you get plenty of comments and feedback and all the rest on your cover letters and on your FAR form itself, right? I think that's important to make sure you get feedback on that too, but your CV and the rest. The other thing is to make sure that you're talking to your references. So you don't want to have a reference surprise that they're listed as a reference for you, right? So having that conversation beforehand and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. Would you be willing to serve as a reference to me? That's right. That's an important conversation. And then the final thing I'll leave with as a general tip, I think, is the greater extent that you can network with faculty members, the better. It's a really useful thing if you have faculty who know you and know your work well and like you and think that you would be a good faculty member, to reach out to the people that they know on hiring committees, to put in a good word. And that will often get your, I think it's important, because I got interviews that I would not have otherwise had been offered if I didn't have those kinds of contacts, verifying, hey, make sure you give this guy's, his appointments packet a look. But of course, these are people who really do know me, right? So, the ask was, if I ask somebody, do you know someone at XYZ school? It's someone who, might have been a reference, or might have been someone who may not have been a reference, but who knows me and my work well and can speak to it. And I think that's the biggest thing in terms of the references, is having people who can speak to you and who you are and all of your accomplishments, because, ultimately what is true is you are a multi-million-dollar risk, right? That a faculty is willing to take on you, because you're going to be making good money, hopefully. And that's, they're investing in you for a number of years, and so what they want to see is, are you really a risk worth taking? Are you someone who's, well put together, has your thoughts together, has a plan, right? When they read your research agenda, can they say, this person is going to get tenure? As long as they stick to this plan, I think this is somebody who's got 2 or 3 articles in the pipeline, who's been thinking about it, who's been thinking about how those articles work together. That's an important, I think that's important. But from the candidate's perspective, as someone doing this last year, that's a hard thing to get right. And so everything I did went through 5 or 6 drafts. So it took a lot of time, and it took a lot of feedback. So if I had not started in June and July, and I was starting on this, late July, early August, I would have been very stressed out, and my work product would have been, for the worst. So, being mindful of your time, getting as much done as you can ahead, and knowing who you are and being true to who you are throughout the entire process. I think those are the big goals. So that's kind of my perspective on the overall process, and maybe some of the things that folks should be thinking about now.
Anthony, thanks very much. You mentioned the silence in the process. Sometimes you don't hear anything. Well, I'm still a candidate, apparently, 10 years later. I haven't heard from some of the schools that I interviewed with. Just a follow-up question for you, Anthony, if I could. You are now a visiting assistant professor. This is a job that you're holding before you start your career as a tenure-track professor at Georgia State. Has this become a non-negotiable part of the credentialing one needs to have to become an entry-level law professor?
If you look at right, so every year, if you haven't looked at or read Prof's blogs, right, folks, you're going to become very familiar with it, I think, in the next few months. But every year, Saralowski puts out a detailed list, a database of, what kind of credentials people have, where they're going, where they're coming from, and the like. And, increasingly so, it is the case that a lot of candidates have advanced degrees, including PhDs, and a lot of candidates, if not really the overwhelming majority of candidates, have some kind of visiting professor or fellowship position before they go into the tenure track market. I have my qualms with this, so this is not an endorsement from a normative perspective, but descriptively, yes, it's almost, one of these kinds of things is almost a de facto requirement for being successful in the market, I think. But here's the thing I would say about it. The mentor, the time and the energy you get from colleagues to mentor you, to work with your job talk paper, to moot your job talks, right? The ability to teach and have teaching evaluations and all these different things that you get through a VAP or a fellowship, I think will make me an incredibly better, much better tenure track investment, and more importantly for me, scholar and teacher, than I would had I not had that experience. So yeah, I think it's certainly something that is looked upon as a requirement or a necessity or a very important addition to the CV. But I think at the same time, whatever issues I do have with that kind of dynamic, there is a valuable, there's a lot to net from that. So, I think that folks should think about that, if they're not in that position now, thinking about how to secure a VAP or fellowship before going on the tenure track market.
Thank you, Anthony. There will be questions for you, so we'll come back to you. I'd like now to turn to Melissa Wasserman, my colleague here at Texas, who is the chair of our appointments committee. I've had the pleasure of working under Melissa's leadership because I'm on her committee. So Melissa, if I could ask you, from your perspective as chair, how does an appointments committee evaluate entry-level candidates? I'm interested in two different stages, both at the stage of reviewing the FAR form that Anthony talked about, and then at the interview stage. Thanks again, Melissa, for agreeing to join us.
Well, thank you, Richard, for putting this together. So I just want to put a couple sort of caveats on what I'm going to say. So I think it's important to recognize that every school does kind of appointments a little bit different. And then even Texas, kind of our approach may change year to year depending on who's the dean, who's the hiring committee, who's on the committee. But I think generally, all schools are going to do a similar type of screening process for candidates, right? And for entry-level candidates. And that typically starts with what Anthony's already discussed is the FAR forms, right? So when those FAR forms come out, the committee is going to get together and we're going to screen through and review all of the FAR forms. There's not a lot of information, right, once you fill those out, but there are lots. We look at everything that's included in there, including the publication record, the writing area, your work experience, right, whether you have a fellowship, your previous sort of employment. And we're going to look at that with keeping in mind what the charge of the committee is that year. So each year, the committee may have a slightly different charge. And what do I mean by that? I mean, right, how many individuals are we looking to hire? Are there any particular areas that either the committee sort of identified or the faculty has identified that we would like to hire in? Are there any areas where we may need to hire in for a teaching need 3-5 years down? Or are there any areas where we're just really full, right? And it might be an area that's not going to be the sort of best fit for us to hire in Texas that year. Once we kind of go through and screen those FAR forms, then the committee gets together again and we discuss as the committee, right, the candidates that each of us have polled, and we have a discussion as whether we think one of these would be a good enough fit at Texas that merit us going back and then reading as a committee their work, right, including the job talk paper. And once we've done that, then we're going to come back to the committee and sort of discuss the paper, right? And so what makes, a good job talk paper, right, is going to Everyone's probably has their own take on this, but obviously it needs to be novel and analytically rigorous. We're looking, right, for your logical argument to kind of flow, for it to be well organized. We're thinking about how our faculty might respond to the paper, right? At this point too, we've usually looped in our subject matter experts on our faculty, where we've asked for their views, right, on the paper, and we're going to take all of this in together to make a decision about whether that candidate should get like a first round interview, right? We'll do that first round interview, and I think Anthony's also touched on this. Once you get to that stage, we've all read your paper, and we think it has a lot of potential. What we're really looking at more is how you're answering questions, I think, at that stage. And so when you're there at that stage, I think you need to be thinking about your paper, and it's a good thing to think about how your paper intersects with different fields, right? The types of questions you may get from people outside of your area, the limitations and the contributions that your paper would make. You know, committees may be asking you questions that there's really no answer to. We just want to see how you would think through the question and the information that you may want, right, in order to answer that question. And so once you've done, you know, Anthony hits it, it's a short time period, right? Maybe 25, 30 minutes. And so you get through your quick elevator pitch, right? And then we start asking questions. Once that's finished, then the committee kind of gets together and we discuss how we've thought all the candidates have done and how well some are going to fit with what we are charged with doing, and which ones we're going to then move on to invite back to do an on-campus interview, right? And I think, you know, what the most important part, right, of the on-campus interview, whether it's a good or a bad thing, is going to be your job talk with the faculty. And what that is, it's just really kind of a blown up, you know, 25-minute session. Now it's an hour and a half, where you're giving typically a 20-minute overview of your paper. And then a lot of it is just how well you Q&A and answer the questions of the faculty. Are you tracking the questions? Are you answering them, right? Are you understanding the limitations of your paper? You know, are there soft points in your paper you're going to get pushed on, and have you thought about how to respond to those? You know, the advice I would give candidates is when you're kind of at that stage, even before, you know, think about writing out answers to the questions you think you're going to get. You know, it's something even that I do now. If I have a lateral interview, I will think about all the questions I think I'm going to get and write out answers to them, so that you've thought and sort of organized how you're going to respond to questions that you're going to get asked.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Melissa. I'm already getting questions for you, so we'll come back to you with more questions. Vikram Amar, thanks for joining us. You are now Dean at the College of Law at University of Illinois, and you've had administrative leadership roles at other universities. What is the role of the larger faculty and administration in the entry-level hiring process?
Well, first, let me thank you, Richard, for inviting me, and hello, Melissa. Nice to see you, and good to meet you, Anthony. I benefited from hearing the insights of both of you. Before I answer your specific question, Richard, I want to kind of double back to something Anthony said, because I'm kind of, you know, the old guy in the room. I went on the teaching market over 25 years ago, and back then, the typical profile of entry-level faculty member was somewhat different than it is today. Here's the respect in which it's not different. Richard, you alluded to this at the front end, and Anthony adverted to a yearly compilation of data on each year's entering professoriate group. So the last year for which there's data had 88, I think, entry-level law faculty hires at the 200 or so ABA-approved schools. And of those 88, almost half, or 40, came from Yale, Harvard, and Stanford as their institution of graduation. Yale had 19 of the 88, or close to a quarter, all by itself. So that, unfortunately, hasn't, or fortunately, I'm not going to weigh in on that, that hasn't changed that much in the time I've been teaching. And if you go past Yale, Stanford, and Harvard, and then looked at NYU and Columbia and Chicago and a few others, there would only be about 8 schools in the United States that make up 3/4 of the entry-level hires in a given year. And that, as I say, hasn't changed too much. If anything, things have telescoped a little bit more into the top 2 or 3. But what Anthony adverted to is something that has changed, and that is the prevalence of people with an advanced degree or a VAP or fellowship. So I didn't have either of those things. I clerked for a couple of years after graduation, then I worked for a large law firm for 3 years, and that was a very conventional path to a tenure track job. But now, in the last year, almost 80% of the people who landed a tenure track job had a fellowship, and close to 75% had an advanced degree. So the vast majority of people had both. Indeed, there was only 1 person out of 88 who lacked a fellowship, an advanced degree, and a judicial clerkship. 87 of the 88 had at least one of those 3, and the vast majority had 2 of them. And the most popular ones now are an advanced degree and a teaching fellowship. And that just wasn't true when I was now. The flip side is a lot more people entering the teaching market don't have any practice background. They didn't work at a law firm. They didn't work in government. They didn't work in public interest. And I actually wish that we had more people who had practical backgrounds as part of the pool. But I just want to you really should consult those big picture data analytics, especially if you're not going on the market this fall, but in the coming years, so you can figure out how to position yourself. Turning to the question, though, that you posited or asked me, Richard, the role of the faculty and the administration. Well, I'll go back to something that a very important point I think that Melissa started with, and that is that every law school is going to be somewhat different in this regard. I think, I've been on appointments committees at 3 or 4 law schools during my career now, and I've probably gone to the recruiting fair in DC over 20 times now in various capacities. And that recruiting fair wasn't even around when I was on the market. I just sent, or it was just starting. Actually, it was there, but I didn't pursue it. I just sent letters to the 15 or so schools I was most interested in, and I was lucky enough that it worked out. I had some geographical constraints. But every school is somewhat different, but once you get invited back from the appointments committee and you give the job talk, virtually every school I'm aware of will then collect data from the faculty, those who attended the job talk, those who were able to watch it later on video if they couldn't attend, people who met the candidate but may not have gone to the job talk, or people who may have read the candidate's work but never even met the candidate. Everyone will chime in, and then typically the appointments committee will take that material and process it and vet it. And then here's where things diverge a little bit. At some schools, the appointments committee will just present that information to the faculty for a kind of a free-for-all faculty discussion and a vote pursuant to one of many different kinds of voting systems that faculties use for a variety of voting decisions. Or at other schools, the faculty appointments committee will essentially make recommendations. They'll propose a course of action, a slate of people to get the thumbs up or to be excluded from consideration, or at least be put on the back burner for now. And so it really depends on the culture, the bylaws, and the history of each faculty, how the faculty interacts with each other and how they interact with the appointments committee at that plenary stage. At some law schools, there's a venerable tradition of deference to the appointments committee. They're the experts. They're the administrative delegates. They've delved into these candidacies, and so they, in exchange for their very careful, time-consuming work, they get the benefit of the doubt. I've been on faculties where that's not remotely the case. Everybody is an expert unto himself or herself, to themselves, and they know what's best, and they don't care what the appointments committee believes. So you really, as you navigate the appointments process at any school where you're invited back for a so-called callback visit, you want to try to do what you can to get a sense of the tradition and the culture and the framework at each school. Typically, there'll be people on the faculty who will be willing to share that with you. If not, some of your advisors may have connections on that faculty, and they can find out a little bit. But the more you know about that, even as you navigate your callback interview, the better. So too, when it comes to the role of the dean, it varies a lot from school to school. Technically, at most schools, the hiring is done literally by the dean, by her, whoever she is, or he is. But very few deans are going to try to strong arm faculties and disregard the sense of the faculty when it comes to extending entry-level offers. At some schools, it may be a bit more of a one-way ratchet. That is to say, the dean would never try to hire someone that the faculty did not approve. And faculty approval thresholds may vary. A lot of faculties have supermajority requirements for conferral of an offer, maybe 2/3, sometimes 3/4. Others may be a little bit reduced. A dean would typically not try to hire somebody that the faculty wasn't supportive of, but I know plenty of deans that won't go forward with extending offers to someone who did have support on the faculty if the dean sees a red flag that matters a lot and is willing to make a stand on that. Now, that's not going to happen often. But it's going to happen from time to time. Relatedly, at some schools, the dean is part of the appointments committee and goes to DC and fully participates in the draft reading and the questioning process. At other schools, the dean is more passive and sits back and waits to hear back from the appointments committee. So again, as you navigate the process at the front end, the more you can learn about the role of the dean, what matters to that particular dean, what that dean's track record is, et cetera. I think those are helpful things. An underappreciated aspect of decanal influence here, it comes after the dean has been authorized to extend offers. It often turns out that the faculty may approve, in theory, more offers than there are slots that can be filled, in which case the dean is then given, or may be given, some discretion about how to proceed with extending the offers. The sequence, sometimes the dean is given input about what the faculty prefers, the rank order, but oftentimes I'll be told, for example, we like these 3 people, we have 2 slots, we leave it to you to reach out to these people, get a sense of who's most likely to say yes, and you get to decide how long a timeline you want to give. You get to decide how much you want to negotiate over a starting package. You want to negotiate a little bit over salary or other perks. And that's a lot of authority that a dean has to act consistently with what the faculty has authorized, but to shape the ultimate outcome that is reached. The final thing I'll say has to do with the role of the central campus, since you asked me that in an email earlier too, Richard. Generally speaking, the central administration's biggest role is in approving the hiring process at the front end. Can Melissa and her committee at UT consider filling 2 slots on the tenure track faculty this year? Sometimes the central campus will want to know a little bit about the subject matter areas that the law faculty anticipates needing. But oftentimes it'll be just a more of a fiscal budgetary, can you afford to pay for these 2 lines? If so, then we'll authorize you to do them. The other thing that campus does is that they try to make sure that the process that is undertaken is an inclusive one, and that a committee has been trained well to understand implicit bias, to understand how casting a wide net is really important, to understand how you shouldn't overlook some kinds of people who may make terrific faculty members in the long run. So campus provides a very useful backstop and set of resources in ensuring the equity and fairness of the processes. And that's a lot better now than it was when I started teaching. I can tell you that there's a lot more attention to that that's being done. I think that's all to the good. The final thing that, but what campus typically doesn't do is once the faculty and the dean have decided this is the person that we want to hire and we work up a file, it's very, very rare that the campus would look at the file, look at the resume, look at the outside letters of support and say this person isn't good enough to join this university. They defer a lot to the law school about judging legal talent. Perhaps even much more so than the law faculty defers to the appointments committee at a typical school. The one area in which I would say that Central Campus sometimes does shape the substantive agenda of a law school and the appointments faculty in its hiring has to do with partner hires. If somebody is up on the market and has a significant other who's also on the market or who's already got a job offer or is already working at a particular university, then that may present an occasion or an opportunity for the university to retain or its current member or hire two rather than one, albeit in different fields. And sometimes this can be wonderful. You can get a person that you never otherwise would have been able to get because their partner is already happy at the university or has a good offer that she or he wants to take. And so you pick up a great find that otherwise you might not be able to. But sometimes a faculty has to make a difficult choice about how much it wants to be a good citizen for the university if it's going to hire someone that it might not have independently wanted to hire. But the partner is somebody that would be great for the university to either attract or retain. So this is like a lot of things, like Melissa said at the outset, it's kind of a very individualized, case-specific kind of inquiry. But if you're in that position where you're part of a couple that's going onto the market or somebody's already got a job, you want to find out everything you can about the campus administrative policies with regard to that. How much do they provide by way of financial support? What is the culture of dual hiring at a university? And at places like Illinois, I can tell you that we're not in a big city like Austin. We get a lot of great people to come to Illinois because we can offer a job maybe to two academics in a very accomplished couple. So again, it's going to vary from university to university, but if you're in that position, that's something you want to explore. And that's a realm where Central Campus can be quite important in providing resources and also cajoling various units to work together. You know, if the law school wants to hire someone, but we need to get the School of Education on board to hire a partner, you know, maybe the Dean of Education doesn't find me a particularly credible person, but maybe the provost can do a little arm twisting to get them to help us out because it would be good for the law school. And by the way, my Dean of Education, I think has a good relationship with me. He's a terrific guy, and so that was just an example, not an illustration. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Vic. Who wouldn't want to have Vic as a dean? Wow. Let's now turn to Elizabeth Katz for our final round of remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'm getting a lot of questions, guys. So Elizabeth, welcome and thank you very much. Once you've been offered a tenure track position, what happens next? So for example, with respect to the particulars of contract negotiation in terms of courses and leaves and remuneration, also maybe moving, what happens when you have to settle into the role and then get started on teaching and writing and balancing the two? Could you say something about that? Thank you again, Elizabeth.
Yes, glad to. And thanks so much for putting this together, Richard. I wish there had been something like this the summer before I went on the market. It's such a great idea. So the first thing you do after you get an offer is you go celebrate. And then you go thank your recommenders and keep them updated on your status. After that, there's some more kind of logistical issues that you'll work through when you're evaluating the offer. So one is typically you would do a return visit to the school, though it's unclear whether there might be something similar to that given the current unusual COVID circumstances. And the second issue is you may be able to negotiate some of the terms of your offer. So I'll talk about both of those things. Starting with the return visits, I'm just going to describe how they usually are since it's so unclear how they might change this year. But if you're able to go on a return visit, it's usually a mix of meeting with your potential future colleagues, wining and dining, and possibly going on a tour of the local real estate with a real estate agent. And you should also have some time to go exploring on your own. It's standard for your partner to be invited on the visit as well. The school pays for all of this, although sometimes you'll pay and then be reimbursed later. While you're there, the school will try to show you why it would be great to join their faculty and live in that area. You might also meet with faculty from other parts of the university, especially if you do interdisciplinary work. Sometimes it might also make sense to meet with local legal practitioners, again, depending on the focus of your scholarship, to think about possibilities for collaboration. The return visit is your chance to ask questions that might be inappropriate or non-strategic at earlier stages in the process. So depending what matters most to you, you might ask about the faculty culture, tenure expectations, and other similar kinds of questions. These days, you might consider asking how the school has responded to COVID. Before and during the return visit, you might ask the school for advice or even assistance in helping your partner find a job. If you do this in advance, some schools will actually set up meetings with local employers for your partner that they can do on the return visit. The other major post-offer issue is possibly negotiating the terms of the offer. Now, of course, the extent to which you could possibly negotiate this will depend on how many offers you have or are likely to have. So I'll address the negotiation options separately for one offer versus multiple offers. But in either situation, you should always continue asking your mentors and keeping them posted. So starting with what to do if you have one offer. It's common to be in the position of having one offer and either perhaps already knowing it's the only offer you're going to receive, or possibly you won't get another offer while the open one is still available, since often there can be short deadlines for accepting or declining. So obviously, if you only have one offer, that limits your leverage as well as the information you can use to negotiate. But there are still several things you might ask for, even if you just have that one offer. Perhaps the most typical, but also very awkward thing that you might ask for is more time to consider the offer. So if your offer is set to expire before other schools are going to get back to you, you could ask for an extension. If you only need perhaps something like a week, you could just ask for this in a straightforward way. But often a week is not going to be sufficient for you to hear back from other schools and possibly go on multiple return visits. So if you need to ask for more time, one option people sometimes use is to offer to withdraw from one or more schools where the candidate is still under consideration in exchange for the extension to hear back from a smaller subset of schools. Again, that can be very awkward to negotiate, but it is something that a lot of people do. The idea here is that you're showing in good faith that you are actually interested in the offer you've already received, but you just want to hear from just a smaller subset of the schools still considering you. So let's say you don't get the extra time, or even if you do, you're still in the position of only having one open offer. Then what can you do? You might find success asking for some combination of the following. And I should mention here, I'm drawing from not only my own experience, but I asked a number of colleagues at other schools who did this within the last couple years, since this can be pretty variable. But things people had success asking for include ask for your pre-tenure courses and course load to be clearly specified in your contract. For an interdisciplinary scholar, you might ask for language in your contract to clarify how your scholarship will fit within the tenure requirements if the ordinary tenure language is ambiguous. So for instance, how do co-authored pieces count if that's typical for your other discipline? Or how do books count if you're trained in a discipline where books are more expected than articles? You might ask for a courtesy appointment in another department if relevant. Ask for funding for a particular program or small conference related to your scholarship. Ask for a guaranteed number of hours of research assistance. Ask for a larger travel budget if there's a reason that's important for your work. For instance, if you do international law or comparative law. Ask that your start date be delayed by a semester or a year if you have the opportunity to continue in a fellowship or for a personal reason, like your partner needs more time to find a new job. And given current circumstances, you might also ask for your contract to state how COVID will affect tenure evaluations and timing. All of these asks are geared toward your early success in your new position, so it seems reasonable to at least inquire, even without a plausible alternative offer in hand. If you're in the even more fortunate position of having 2 or more offers at the same time, then you have more information and leeway to expand the list of terms you might request. And keep in mind, of course, that this list is something I put together with people who went on the market in the pre-COVID years. So in past cycles, entry-level hires have successfully requested the following by comparing the terms of multiple offers: an additional semester or course off for pre-tenure leave, a change to 1 class in their proposed teaching package, an increase in salary or summer research stipend to match the more generous offer, an increase in the research or travel budget, a shorter tenure clock to match the offer that permits tenure more quickly, and finally, additional funding related to moving, such as a moving stipend or funding for an extra visit to go house hunting. Of course, be reasonable in your asks, keeping in mind that you may join this school even if you don't get any of these things that you're asking for. 3 final tips at this stage. First, throughout this process, you want to make sure other schools where you're under consideration know you've received an offer and what your deadline is. Usually it makes sense to communicate this to the hiring chair. Second, for the sake of everyone else on the market, be prompt in releasing offers when you've decided they aren't the right fit for you. Third, keep your recommenders updated about the status of your interviews and offers, as they could receive calls at any time about you, and they can also provide advice. So I have just a few moments left, so I'll turn to what happens after you've accepted one of these offers. So first, give yourself a bit of a break if you can. As Anthony was suggesting, this whole process is inevitably very time-consuming and stressful. It can feel very all-consuming for months on end. So if you can give yourself a bit of a break, you should definitely try to do that. Don't assume you can jump right back into your scholarship, given everything else that you've just been working through. When you've recovered, the next steps depend on where you are in the calendar. So depending on timing, you might start thinking about the logistics of your move. Consult with your new colleagues about neighborhoods and other details. In addition to their advice being helpful, it's a nice way to keep in touch before you arrive. And then get as much done on your teaching prep and scholarship as you can. Your first semester on the tenure track will fly by because you're meeting all sorts of new people, you're getting settled into a new home, you're teaching 1 or maybe 2 classes you've never taught before. It's all just very time consuming. So as much as you can do before you arrive, you'll definitely appreciate that later.
Elizabeth, thank you. You should write those up because that's valuable. Vic, you wanted to add a couple of thoughts to follow up on Elizabeth's comments, please.
Yeah, I actually, very nice to meet you, Elizabeth. I just wanted to amplify some really nuanced things I thought Elizabeth said that I thought were worth pointing out. I mentioned the partner hiring process on campus, and so did Elizabeth, but notice that she said you raised that after you got the offer. And this is a statement against interest, but if I were advising people on the market, I think I would do that. I would not wear that on my sleeve too early in the process. I try to find out information about a university's policies and opportunities with regard to partner hires, but I wouldn't want to be too upfront about that for fear that some people might conclude that that makes it less likely that I would land at that school and be less interested in me. Now, I don't even know if it's legal for a school to think that way, but I'm just talking, reality. I wouldn't want to do anything that was kind of against interest. Second, Elizabeth made another good point when she said, even if you don't have another offer out there, that doesn't mean you don't have any leverage to make reasonable requests. A school wants to fill its slots when it, especially if you're the first choice, if you're the first person to whom a school has extended an offer, they want to land you. The faculty wants to know the dean landed their choice. The campus likes to know that we're landing our first choices, et cetera. So, as long as you're not being unreasonable, you don't need another offer to try to ask for things that would make life better for you at this school. And the school wants you to succeed if it brings you on. It doesn't want you to come with reservations about how easy it is going to be for you to succeed. But that brings me to the third point, and this is one that I think you don't appreciate until you're a dean, maybe. And that was the admonition to make your requests reasonable. People, will ask me a ton of stuff, and I'll explain to them why I can't accommodate all of it, and they won't let go. They won't listen. They won't understand. And I'm thinking to myself, you're coming to a school where I might be your dean for an extended period of time, and there's so many things that I want to do to make life good for you. But I never try to take anything into account against somebody, but don't underestimate the value of goodwill that you have with your administration and the faculty. They want to know that you want to be there and that you're not there unhappily. And that so asking for things is fine, but the flip side of that is understanding what can and can't be done and why not. And don't burn that goodwill that you come in, when you get an offer, you have so much goodwill at the front end. That's an incredible asset for the rest of your career at that institution. And you should be mindful of that.
Thank you, Vic. Melissa, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, just really quick, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because I don't know how this is applicable to everybody. But with the dual hiring, I think it's very kind of specific. So my husband's has a 10-year track job in engineering, right? And so I went through it. I was at Illinois before I moved to Texas. And when I was on the entry level, I actually told people about my husband when I was interviewing on campus, which people had said was maybe risky, a little bit too early, but I think it really depends upon you. We had young children, right? We definitely wanted to be at the same school, right? And so I was willing to risk some schools not looking at me if they knew it wasn't going to be able to work for my husband and him, vice versa. So, I think the dual hiring is maybe not applicable, but if people have specific, questions, feel free to follow up because I think it's nuanced depending on your situation.
That is helpful.
I agree with that.
So let us now go to the queue of questions. First is Zalman Rothschild. Please, you are unmuted, followed by Christopher Dinkle. Please.
Thank you. This question I think is primarily for Melissa. And again, just thank you so much for doing this. This has been extremely helpful, extremely illuminating. I'm curious to know, you talked quite a bit about the job talk paper, and that does seem to play a very central role in all this entire process. I'm curious to know about an applicant's other papers in his or her portfolio, and the extent to which they carry any or how much weight, and at what stage do you look at those other pieces? Do you read them closely? Do you skim them? I'm assuming that at this first stage, when you just glance through all the FARS forms, you're not reading the papers in one's portfolio, but correct me if I'm wrong. So relatedly, I'm also curious to know, what are you basing the decision on as to whether you will interview somebody at the meat market? Obviously, the more and the higher ranked papers you have, the better, but is there some kind of basic threshold, basic minimum, like that's realistic? And my last question is, you mentioned how teaching needs can really play a role and can influence the decision of who you're going to even interview. Is con law sort of fatal if that's your only teaching interest? Is it really important to have another course like something in the private law sphere? Or is it actually the case that there are years where common law is a legitimate need?
Well, Richard can chime on this as well. I mean, okay, so the first thing I would say about the papers, I think it depends is when they're written. So if that's a student note and you went and then got a PhD or something, and then, you know, like there's a duration, a long duration, right? We're going to be probably more focused on looking at things that you recently wrote. So if you wrote multiple pieces in your fellowship, yeah, we may look at both of those pieces. It also, I think, depends on, right, where your kind of job talk is, if it's completely finished and polished, right, or if it's more sort of early stage, we're going to be looking at some of the older pieces as well. But things that are more recently written, because I don't think a student note is really, at this day and age, and the market, super reflective maybe of the work that you're doing once you've had a year or two possibly in a fellowship where you've been writing maybe at a more serious level. So that would be kind of my answer to what other work are we reading. But if you have multiple, you know, pieces that you've written recently, we're going to be looking at all of those typically, with a little bit more focus on the job talk, because we're looking at the job talk too, as well as how well are you going to present in front of our faculty? How receptive will they be to this work? Things along those lines as well, we're thinking of. Then you also asked, oh, like what else are we looking at on the FAR form? Is that what you were asking, to make that an?
Right, I just mean, I assume there's no like magical like threshold number, but I'm just wondering realistically, is there some sense about quantity and quality?
No, I mean, I don't think there's a magical realistic number. You know, we're looking for publications, right? And most of the people that are coming from a fellowship, right, are going to have, or have had time to write, are going to have publications listed, right? And it doesn't mean that your piece has to be placed, right? But you have to have it listed, right, as a work that, you know, typically may be under submission, right, in the fall, that we have access and we can read. And so I think that along with the area, which I just mean as that depends on what the charge is of every appointments committee, right, for that particular year, right, what they're sort of focused on with respect to hiring, which could be completely open-ended, right, just hire the best athlete, or depending on certain schools, right, it may be very specific, like we need to hire an IP or we need to hire in corporate law or something along those lines. So I don't think con law hurts you at all. I mean, that's a 1L class, you know, faculties always need individuals to teach the 1L curriculum, right? That's another thing people may tell you, right? And I think Elizabeth hit on this when you're listing, or maybe Anthony, when you're listing courses, right? It's nice if you can also list some sort of course that may have a larger, right, enrollment that you will teach as well, whether that's con law. It doesn't have to be a 1L course. You know, it could be corporations or tax or something else that generally carries a larger enrollment as well.
Thank you for that. I want to come to Anthony and Vic if I could. Anthony, you teach con law. Vic, of course, you've been in con law for a long time, helped shape the field. Anthony, what was your experience interviewing as a con law candidate? I think you'll be teaching con law related subjects. And then Vic, could you help us think maybe long-term, midterm to long-term planning for someone interested in being a con law professor?
So, you know, I think there's some traditional advice that people say avoid listing con law or avoid listing it, because before you used to rank on the FAR form and people thought they were trying to game the system. And I think that this year they've ended the actual ranking of the core courses. But for me, I think that the truth of the matter is I wrote about con law issues and it was obviously it was an area of interest, but my package as a whole, right, I had con law and employment discrimination, which are employment discrimination is one of my main areas that I work in. But I also had, I think it was family law, legislation, and admin. I mean, they were a variety of courses, but they all were actually torts was in there as well. So, right, so I had some different courses. In my research agenda, I explained why they were all kind of cohesive and they made sense. So I obviously had other courses beyond con law. That being said, hiring committees, that they know they can kind of figure out who you are by your writing, right? So, I'm not getting a heck of a lot of family law, interviews, but I was getting a lot of con law interviews because my research and my research agenda, my publications really scream con law. So, I think that, again, if you're interested in con law, then, people will know, who you are, and they will figure that out. But I think the other thing is to be able to articulate what other courses in a package that you might want to teach. So, for me, it was con law, employment discrimination, and then maybe admin or legislation. And I explained why that package was probably, an ideal and how it all fit. I mean, I think it's pretty transparent how that all fits. But for some schools that needed family law or needed torts, right, I had an explanation about why I was interested in torts and how that would fit in with, say, constitutional torts and 1983 actions and my interest in employment discrimination. So, yes, I had other courses on there, core courses, required courses that were not con law, that schools were interested in me for. And I, for every school, knowing what they were advertising in, right, I could answer why I was interested in that package and what I could bring to it. So.
Great, thank you. Vic, do you want to comment on this?
Sure. Again, I've been doing this for a while. I think sometimes people get a sense, the word on the street, so to speak, that there's a hot field or two fields that are really hot, and you should always make sure that you have something in your FAR form that touches those, or there are oversaturated fields like con law, and you shouldn't list that at all because they're a dime a dozen. And A, I think sometimes that word on the street is not always accurate. And B, even when it's accurate, it's sometimes dated. And you're kind of chasing something that's no longer reality. So for example, last year at Illinois, we were looking first and foremost for a con law person. That was the field that we were, we had some really good people, but we didn't have as many good people as I might have expected, because I think a lot of people had gotten the word not to put con law on their form, et cetera. I think Anthony's right that you want your package of courses to be as kind of broad as is reasonably accurate, to show that you're flexible and that you can do a lot of things for the school, but it also needs to knit together in a way. So for example, Anthony has a good explanation for why torts and con law, things that ordinarily wouldn't be taught by the same person, fit together for him. And actually one of my best friends teaches those two things. But if someone, for example, listed securities regulations and con law as their two main fields, I would say, okay, explain to me how we're doing this here. How those really fit together as a coherent area of research inquiry. Now, Richard, your question about kind of directions within con law, to the extent that the questioner wanted that, it's an interesting one. I'm probably relatively unusual these days in that I am a constitutional generalist. I write about structural issues, federalism, separation of powers, but I also write about free speech and religion and equality and voting rights. Most people today, I think, who do con law are going to be focused on a part of con law, whether it's freedom of expression, whether it's equality issues, race, gender, LGBTQ, et cetera, or versus structural separation of powers, foreign affairs, the intersection of foreign affairs and con law, et cetera. So I think you want to be genuine no matter what you do. I think there's still room for generalists out there. I mean, some of the biggest con law names in the country, whether it's Erwin Chemerinsky or my brother or Larry Tribe, et cetera, these are con law generalists. And so there's still room to do that. But if you are someone who enters con law through a particular lens or perspective, don't be afraid to highlight that and demonstrate the depth of your work in that area. And then the final thing I'll say is, I think going forward, combining constitutional law with other legal and even non-legal disciplines, it makes for very attractive candidacies. So the field, Richard, that you work in, comparative con law, and constitutional reform and constitutional systems. You write more about constitutional design than you do substantive con law. And I think that's an important area, especially in a comparative framework. I think today, people who have depth in history, whether they have an advanced degree or not, who understand not just the founding era, but in my mind, more importantly, the Reconstruction era, and can bring that to inform their understanding of the Constitution and their writing about it, that combination is a very powerful one itself. So as well, so you want to be authentic, you want to be genuine, and understand that there's nothing. I'll give the same advice I give when I tell people who are applying to law schools or colleges and they're writing their essays. Don't spend too much time trying to think about what they're looking for. Think about who you are and how to present the best, most exciting version of that is.
Oh, that's great. Great advice. Before we go to the next question from Christopher Dinkle, let me ask a question to Elizabeth, if I could, because we've been talking about publishing. You mentioned, Vic, maybe cognate fields, history. Elizabeth, you have a PhD from Harvard University in history. Let me ask you a question about publishing. Is it common for people to publish parts of their dissertation as law review articles, and then in turn seek to publish it as a book? And when it comes to getting that evaluated for tenure purposes, do both count? Do you have any thoughts on that, reactions to that question?
Yeah, that's a really great question and an important thing for people to think about in advance so they don't accidentally publish too much of the dissertation and then run into a tricky spot. So speaking as a historian, I don't know how much it might vary for some other fields, but the rule of thumb I've heard is you shouldn't publish more than roughly a quarter to a third of the material you eventually expect to have in a book in articles beforehand, because then it's just going to be too redundant and a publisher wouldn't want to pick that up. So what that meant, to kind of put it in practical terms, for me, is the job market paper I used drew from my dissertation research, but it significantly changed the framing and the argument to be more appropriate and interesting for a legal audience. Some of the arguments I make in the dissertation are more geared toward intervening in conversations historians are having. So if you were to compare my dissertation and that one article, you would see some overlapping information, but it's just a very different piece of scholarship. So to me, and with the advice of my mentors, that didn't seem risky at all. And maybe I could do one more article with some overlap with the dissertation without running it into any problems later with the book. I know some people do publish basically a chapter as an article, which is another approach, but that just didn't fit as well with the arguments that I wanted to make.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Christopher Dinkle, I think you are unmuted. Please go ahead with your question.
Hi, thank you all so much to the presenters and for Richard for organizing. This has been extremely helpful. My questions are related to publications at the application stage. So first, all things being equal, how important is it to already have a solo authored law review publication versus one completed as a co-author with a law faculty member? Second, how much do peer-reviewed publications in other fields that are related to law count for? So like, for instance, a political science peer review publication, but on law. And then lastly, does the answer to the first two questions change if a person is applying for a VAP or fellowship rather than an entry-level tenure-track position?
Thank you, Christopher. Melissa, would you like to take a crack at that?
Sure. So if you're going to go on the market, so law, I think still has this bias where they like to see some solo authored articles, right? Whether we agree with that or not. I think it's going to be more difficult to go on with if the only thing you're going on with is something that's co-authored with an established person in your field. I just think it's going to be more difficult, whether it should or not. You know, your co-author would have to kind of make sure they're sort of stepping up and being clear about what your contributions are to the paper. And I think that there'll be some faculty that may be a little resistant to that. That's just where law is. I don't necessarily agree with the sort of bias against co-authoring, but that seems to be something at least somewhat on the entry level. So I would just say keep that in mind. And and how much would, I think, peer-reviewed papers and other fields, we would certainly look at those, right? I mean, so there's definitely a number of faculty members at Texas and other, you know, that do peer review in other fields. I peer review in economics journals, for instance. So there's no reason why the appointments committee would certainly read and look at those papers as well. And, you know, I've definitely know a number of people who have gone on the entry-level market, maybe with a piece that was peer-reviewed. Now they may sort of change the presentation a little bit for a law audience, including maybe fleshing out more of the normative take, depending on where you're peer reviewing. But I think that's very, I don't want to say typical, but that definitely happens.
Great, thank you very much, Melissa. Any of the other panelists want to weigh in on this question? If not, let me ask a question to Anthony. Vic, yeah. Okay, please.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with what Melissa said, and on the solo authorship thing, I think it's changing, but she's right that there's still, especially at the entry level stage, when you haven't yet kind of established your bona fides with the faculty that you'd like to join, it's good for them to know kind of what you did all on your own and not have to wonder about whether somebody else was really pulling the weight on a piece. With regard to the peer-reviewed question, I think that here too, like a lot of these answers, it varies a little bit from faculty to faculty. Now, I mentioned at the outset that we've seen this huge trend in increasing prevalence of advanced degrees among law professors, which I think is generally a great thing. At the same time, there is something distinctive about a law school compared to a poli-sci department, and we are training lawyers to enter the profession. The vast majority of people who graduate from all the schools that we're talking about, great schools, are going to go on to be lawyers. And so you want to make sure that that peer-reviewed non-law venue piece really highlights your distinctive skill at legal analysis and the kind of legal logic that Melissa talked about earlier about a structural argument, even if it's an empirical piece, which empirical pieces are very rigorous, but you want to show that it's really law focused. You know, again, I'm a bit of an old-fashioned person maybe, but I like to see kind of real depth in law and not just, I love law and, but I don't want the and to overtake the law part. For a law faculty that's training us. And I guess I'd make a related point. You know, a lot of people on law faculties may not feel sure-footed in evaluating stuff that's written really not for a legal audience. It's like, how do I know whether this is good poli-sci stuff if I'm not really well steeped in that scholarship generally? So the venue of publication is not going to be a disqualifying factor, but you want to make sure that it highlights kind of what you can add to a law school on the merits of the piece.
Wonderful. I think we have two quick follow-ups, first from Elizabeth and then from Melissa.
So related to this, there's another reason having solo authored work on your CV is helpful that I didn't anticipate going into the process, which is when you're on your callback, I found that people did not want to only talk about my job talk piece all day. I think especially in the interviews before your lunch job talk, it seemed to me people gravitated toward other parts of my CV, either maybe to give me a break from thinking about that or just to get a fuller sense of my scholarship. So if your CV just has a very short list or maybe a list that only has a co-authored piece, it might be a little more challenging to have those kinds of productive conversations about your broader scholarly agenda.
So, and then I'll just add a really quick follow-up. I think with the co-authoring piece for me, specifically, or when I think I think it's very different if you're co-authoring with somebody who's sort of junior at your level, right? Than if you're co-authoring with a senior person in your field. And even if you sort of brought most of whatever you're doing with the senior person in the field, I think that's where you're going to get more in trouble if you're trying to use that piece as your job talk.
So helpful, guys. Thank you very much. We have more questions from the floor. I'm going to come to them in a moment, but first I'd like to ask Anthony a question. How does an incoming tenure track candidate learn about the tenure expectations, the tenure standards? Does one get very clear guidelines and expectations? And if so, communicated by whom?
Yeah, that's great. So my strategy was, whenever all my callbacks, I made it a point to try to figure out what person I was meeting with who might be the best person to ask that. So sometimes that might have been the dean, but usually my go-to person on a callback to ask that was if I had a one-on-one meeting or a meeting with like an associate dean or an assistant dean for scholarly life or scholarly advancement or something like that, right? So somebody who's the point person for the scholarly well-being of the law school community, and usually in that meeting there were some some people who were out of the gate said, let me tell you about our tenure expectations and process, and that was fantastic. And then there were other times where, at every interview, every little interview you do on a callback, everyone always asks at the end, do you have any questions for me now? And, even sometimes those are that's the first thing you get. And so, I was always ready that if I had not already had that conversation, that I knew, right, that person who I identified as probably the most likely to want to engage in that conversation. I would say, I'm curious, what are the tenure expectations? What are the processes that you have in place here? Is there anything unique about it at this school? And usually I would dovetail that conversation off with, well, what kinds of support do you offer in order to help candidates get there? So it was able to have a nice natural conversation about the expectations and the support that was available to help entry-level professors get to that and achieve whatever I wanted to achieve.
Okay, that's helpful. We have maybe 2 questions left. Let me bring them to let's say Vic and Melissa, I think. Very relevant to the 2 of you, given your positions. We've had 2 or 3 questions asking about how the present public health emergency is going to change anything, if at all, about this year's hiring process, but maybe in years to come in the near term, let's say next year and the year after. Melissa and Vic and Melissa?
Melissa, would you like to go first?
I think you should go first. You probably
okay.
This.
So here too, I think it really does depend on the school. There are a lot of major universities that announced a hiring freeze this spring, and maybe that will thaw for some of them going forward. Many law schools and universities impose some kinds of furloughs or temporary pay cuts. At Illinois, we didn't do either of those things. But there was a clear message from on high that hiring is going to be evaluated more stringently this year until what your giving budget, how this is affecting your private giving. For those like Texas and Illinois who are public institutions, until you know for sure how it's affecting public allocations. And then also, there's still a tremendous uncertainty about the 1L class coming in. As we're all making announcements about what the fall is going to look like, we don't know what the melt is going to be. And with melt comes lost dollars, obviously. So there's a fiscal element to all of this that's creating some uncertainty. So as a general matter, I would say hiring will probably be a little bit more conservative and constrained this year and maybe even next year as the fiscal position kind of works itself through than it has been the last few years. And then there's the second point that I think Melissa and Elizabeth and Anthony all raised, and that's the logistics of hiring in an era where in-person meetings are harder to come in. Now, I find that transacting business by Zoom is good. I mean, I'd rehire Melissa in a heartbeat from this Zoom, and Anthony and Elizabeth, I'd want to bring you back to my faculty as well. But not everybody feels that they can assess talent virtually very well. I personally think reading people's papers and focusing on that, I think I sometimes believe that we overvalue our ability to assess somebody in a 30-minute interview session. But a lot of faculty are wary of hiring people who are not going through that normal thing. So I think both of those argue in favor of a slower hiring year this year and maybe next year. But the flip side is there are going to be some schools that see this as a buying opportunity. and they say, okay, there are fewer of our peers in the market right now, and we have the financial stability and the planning and the support of our central campus. Let's go steal some people that otherwise we may lose to another great school this year. So if you were going to go on the market this year, I don't want to dissuade you from doing that. But I guess what I'd say is if you go on the market and it doesn't work out, don't assume that it might not work out later as well.
Yeah, I don't have that much to add. I think, I totally agree with what Vic said. And I don't know how, I mean, we don't know how many schools are going to be hiring right actively in the fall. For Texas, for example, they announced a hiring freeze in the spring, but we don't know what's going to happen for next year. But I do think Vic made an excellent point, right? Even if it ends up being tighter next year, if it doesn't work out, right, that doesn't mean it won't in the future as well.
Okay, great. We have two, I think, related questions. So let me call on Elvaldo Moita and then Pierre-André Thériault. So they'll ask their questions one at a time consecutively, and then we'll go to the panel. I think their questions are maybe best answered by Melissa and Vic and Melissa. Please.
All right. Thank you all very much for your time. It was mentioned, especially by Vikram, that there are some set of qualities that are desired, such as advanced degrees, visiting the appointments, fellowships, and experience as a clerk. But what about international candidates? And how are they evaluated regarding those desired qualities? Or are there other special requirements they should have if they would like to apply in the US? In some, all do law faculties welcome international candidates? Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo and Pierre-André.
Right, my question was essentially the same. I'm zooming in from Toronto, Canada, and it's not uncommon here for law schools to hire applicants that have their JD and advanced degrees from other countries. And I'm wondering how US schools, would they ever hire an applicant that has the JD, LLM, PhD, teaching fellowship, clerkship, publications, but all of that in another country and no bar membership, obviously, in a US state. Thank you.
Thank you. Melissa, Vic, Melissa.
Well, I can say, I think this is also probably going to be school specific, would be my guess, right? And the culture of the school on this issue. So we've certainly looked at, I think, Texas and the appointments committee, a number of candidates that were international. And there it just comes down to a matter of reading the work and seeing how good of a fit it is, as well as we have discussions about how their legal education compares to the US, because there's always a concern about teaching law in the US and whether their sort of educational background would enable them to come in and teach our students, right? As well as not just certain specialty classes, but, more of the larger curriculum. So those are the discussions that we've had, I think, in the past, but there's nothing, we don't have anything that suggests, oh no, if you're international, right, we're not gonna look at you as a candidate.
So I concur with what Melissa just said, and it is going to be somewhat school specific. At both Illinois and schools that I've been on the tenured faculty on earlier in my career, we've had members of the faculty who had a law degree only from a foreign institution. I will say, actually, I mentioned that Yale, Stanford, Harvard, and Stanford are the three biggest feeders in last year. But I think the fifth biggest feeder, with 4 people out of the 88, was Hebrew University, where someone got their initial law degree. So I think if it's a well-known, well-regarded foreign institution, and the ones you mentioned, University of Toronto, I mean, these are world-class universities, you're going to have credibility. The committee, like Melissa, is going to read the work and make an evaluation based on the work. The one thing I would double back on, though, is it may be even more important for somebody who didn't have a JD coming from the United States or an LLM from the United States after getting their basic legal training elsewhere. Maybe even more important for them to have some visitorship or fellowship experience at an American law school to show that they understand the culture, that they work with students, that faculty kind of, that they're able to connect and network with American law faculty, which is an important quality going forward, et cetera. So it may make that even a more helpful thing to have. More generally, on the prevalence of advanced degrees and fellowships, I mean, Melissa's an empiricist much more than I am. I don't know what's, cause and effect and the like. I just, that as I said, the statistics show that of the vast majority of people who cleared the market last year had actually both of those things, and almost everybody had one of them. So does that mean you can't be considered or get a good job without them? Of course not. But it just means that you pay attention to what the trends are.
So helpful. Thank you, guys. If I could maybe just extend our call for maybe 1 or 2 minutes more with a final question for Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you have now just finished your first year at WashU as an entry-level tenure-track professor. What's the best part of the job now that you're on the other side?
Great question. I mean, there's so much I love about this position. I'd say that the part that really stands out to me the most from the first year is how wonderful the students were. I mean, it was quite the experience transitioning to Zoom while teaching a 1L class for the first time, but the students were so resilient and committed and thoughtful that it was a really wonderful experience. And it's really the teaching that makes the faculty position different from the fellowship and the other roles I had previously. So it was a great year, and I'd say teaching is what really stands out.
Oh, that's great. And Anthony, if I could ask you, what are you most looking forward to as you begin to join Georgia State as a first-year tenure-track professor?
I think it's just being able to finally really get into my research agenda and start writing and accomplishing kind of the big tasks on my research agenda that I've put off because I wanted to keep them fresh for tenure. And I think just a kind of very similar to what Elizabeth said, I think the biggest joy of my teaching at Chicago Kent has been developing a rapport with my students. So being able to become a part of the Georgia State community and connect with my students, certainly something I'm looking forward to.
Well, now everyone sees why this was the cast of 4 that I wanted to present to the registrants. It's really a great group. Melissa Wasserman, Elizabeth Katz, Vikram, Amar, Anthony Kreis. Thanks so much to you 4 for making time today. Your summer day, you could have been writing. You could have been doing whatever. Thank you so much for saying yes. And thanks to the registrants for joining in. Everyone have a good weekend. Stay safe and see you in person when it's safe to do so again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.